The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Mark Jensen adjusted his hard hat. The constant hum of demolition equipment filled the air around him. It was September 1997, and Oakridge Memorial Hospital in Millfield, Ohio, was undergoing its most extensive renovation since the 1960s. As the lead structural engineer, Mark had spent weeks analyzing blueprints of the aging facility, but something had been bothering him. "I'm telling you, Dave, these measurements don't add up," Mark said, tapping his pencil against the large blueprints spread across a makeshift table. "There's at least 30 feet of unaccounted space between the East Wing and the administration building." Dave Miller, the project supervisor, sighed and ran a hand through his graying hair. "Mark, these buildings were constructed in different phases over decades. Old hospitals are full of weird design quirks. We're already behind schedule as it is. Just give me an hour. That's all I'm asking," Mark insisted. Dave checked his watch, a digital Casio that his wife had given him for Christmas in '95. "Fine. 1 hour. Take Rodriguez with you." Carlos Rodriguez was the newest member of their team, a recent engineering graduate with an enthusiasm that reminded Mark of himself 20 years ago. The two men made their way through the partially demolished East Wing, stepping carefully over debris and exposed wiring. "So what exactly are we looking for?" Carlos asked, his voice echoing slightly in the empty corridor. "According to these blueprints, there should be a solid wall here," Mark said as they reached the end of the hallway. "But if my calculations are right, there's space behind it. A lot of space." Mark ran his hand along the wall, knocking occasionally to test for hollow spots. The wall was covered in that particular shade of institutional green paint that seemed to be mandatory in every American hospital built before 1970. As they moved closer to the corner, the sound changed. "You hear that?" Mark asked. Carlos nodded. "Sounds hollow." Mark examined the wall more closely, noticing a nearly imperceptible seam. I think there might be a door here that was plastered over." After borrowing a hammer from a nearby toolbox, Mark carefully began to chip away at the plaster. As pieces fell to the floor, the outline of a doorway emerged. Within 20 minutes, they had exposed an old metal door, its once white paint now yellowed with age. A faded sign hung askew. "Psychiatric department. Authorized personnel only." "This isn't on any of the blueprints," Mark muttered, more to himself than to Carlos. The door was locked, but the years had weakened the mechanism. With a forceful push from both men, it gave way with a groan of protesting metal. The air that rushed out was stale and carried a musty scent that made both men cover their noses. "God, that's awful," Carlos said, his voice muffled by his hand. Mark pulled out his flashlight, a heavy maglite that cast a bright beam into the darkness beyond the door. The light revealed a long corridor, untouched by time except for a thick layer of dust that covered everything like a gray shroud. Spiderwebs hung from the ceiling, and small particles danced in the beam of light. "Call Dave," Mark said quietly. "He needs to see this." Within 15 minutes, Dave had arrived with Sarah Chen, the hospital's administrative director, who had been overseeing the renovation from the client side. Her normally composed face showed clear shock as she stared into the darkened corridor. "This isn't possible," she said. "I've worked here for 12 years. I've seen every blueprint, every renovation plan since the hospital opened in 1926. There's no record of this wing." "Well, it's definitely here," Dave replied. "Question is, what do we do about it?" Sarah hesitated only briefly. "We need to document everything before we continue. This could affect the entire renovation timeline, but we need to understand what we're dealing with." Mark led the way into the corridor, their footsteps leaving clear imprints in the dust. The air felt heavy, oppressive somehow, as if the very atmosphere was resisting their intrusion. The corridor extended about 50 feet before opening into what appeared to be a nurse's station. The station was frozen in time. A clipboard still lay on the counter, a rotary phone sat silent on the desk, and a half-filled coffee mug had long since evaporated, leaving only a dark stain at the bottom. A large board on the wall listed patient names and room numbers in faded chalk. "Look at this," Carlos said, pointing to a calendar hanging on the wall. "December 1948. Almost 50 years, Sarah whispered. "This place has been sealed off for 50 years. Mark moved his flashlight across the nurse's station, illuminating a logbook open on the desk. The last entry was dated December 17th, 1948. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. Dr. Kaplan ordering emergency protocol. "All patients to be—" The entry ended abruptly, a pen still marking the page where it had been abandoned. "Emergency protocol for what?" Dave wondered aloud. Sarah was examining the patient board. There were 23 patients here when whatever happened, happened. Mark continued down the hallway, his flashlight beam revealing a row of doors on either side. Each had a small window and a name card. Elizabeth Winters, read one. Thomas Gould, read another. The rooms were small, institutional, and eerily preserved. Beds neatly made, some personal items still on bedside tables. "We need to call someone," Carlos said, his earlier enthusiasm now replaced with unease. "The hospital board? Maybe the historical society." "I agree," Sarah replied. "But first, let's see what else is here. This is part of the hospital's history. History no one knew existed." They continued their exploration, finding examination rooms, a small dispensary with medicine bottles still on the shelves, and what appeared to be a recreation room with board games mid-play, chairs pushed back, as if the occupants had suddenly left. At the end of the corridor was a heavy door marked Records. Inside, filing cabinets lined the walls, filled with patient charts meticulously organized by year, starting from 1926 when the hospital first opened. Mark pulled out a random folder. "Margaret Watkins, admitted June 4, 1937. Diagnosis, female hysteria and nervous disposition." He frowned at the outdated terminology. Sarah was examining another cabinet. "The records are complete up until December 1948. Then they just stop." She pulled out the last folder. The final patient admitted was a man named Robert Fisher on December 15, 1948, 2 days before that last log entry. Dave, who had been unusually quiet, called from across the room. "You all need to see this." He had found a locked cabinet, which had broken open with age. Inside were files marked "Restricted" in red ink. Dave had one open on a dusty table. "This wing wasn't just psychiatric," he said grimly. According to these documents, in 1943 they began a research program in collaboration with the government, something called Project Lighthouse. World War II era, Sarah noted. There were all sorts of classified medical research programs during that time. Mark skimmed the document Dave had found. It says they were researching treatments for battle trauma, what we'd call PTSD today. But the methods, he trailed off, his expression darkening. They were experimenting with some unconventional approaches: electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, experimental pharmaceuticals. Carlos had wandered to the back of the records room, where his flashlight illuminated another door. "There's something else here," he called out. The door led to a laboratory. Unlike the almost peaceful abandonment of the patient rooms, this space showed signs of chaos. Overturned chairs, broken glass on the floor, papers scattered everywhere. A large machine dominated the center of the room, something like an early electroshock device, but with modifications none of them recognized. "What the hell happened here?" Dave muttered. Sarah had found a film projector and several canisters of film labeled "Patient Observations," with dates ranging from 1943 to 1948. Nearby was a camera, an expensive Bolex 16mm model that would have been state-of-the-art in the 1940s. "We should leave everything as we found it," she decided. "I'm calling the board and the Historical Society today. This needs to be properly documented and preserved." As they were preparing to leave, Mark noticed something carved into the wall near the laboratory door, partially hidden behind a filing cabinet. He pushed the cabinet aside slightly to reveal words scratched deeply into the plaster. "They are coming through. God help us all." An involuntary chill ran down his spine. "Probably one of the patients," he said, trying to sound more nonchalant than he felt. The group made their way back to the entrance, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had found. Before leaving, Mark took one last look down the darkened corridor. For just a moment, he thought he heard something, like distant whispering, but convinced himself it was just the sound of the ventilation system in the active part of the hospital. 3 days later, Mark found himself back at Oakridge Memorial, this time accompanying Dr. Eleanor Reed, a medical historian from Ohio State University, and Michael Tanner, a representative from the Ohio Historical Society. The renovation had been temporarily halted in the East Wing while the historical significance of the discovery was assessed. "It's extraordinary," Dr. Reed was saying as they approached the sealed wing, a perfectly preserved psychiatric ward from the 1940s. "The research potential is enormous. The hospital board is very interested in preserving as much as possible," Sarah Chen explained, walking alongside them. "They see this as an opportunity to document an important part of medical history, even if some aspects of it are troubling." Michael Tanner nodded in agreement. Medical ethics have evolved considerably since the 1940s. What we find might be disturbing by modern standards, but it's important historical context. As they entered the hidden wing, now illuminated by portable work lights that cast harsh shadows on the institutional walls, Dr. Reed immediately began documenting everything with a digital camera, a new Sony Mavica that saved images directly to a floppy disk. The technology would have seemed like science fiction to the doctors who had once worked in these halls. "I've been researching the hospital's history," Dr. Reed said as she photographed the nurses' station. Oakridge was known for its psychiatric treatment in the 1930s and 40s. The chief of psychiatry was a Dr. Victor Kaplan, the same Kaplan mentioned in that last logbook entry. He was quite prominent in his field, published extensively on treating combat-related neuroses after the First World War. "Then why isn't there any record of this wing or his research here?" Sarah asked. "That's the mystery," Dr. Reed replied. "After 1948, there's no mention of Kaplan in any medical journal. It's as if he disappeared completely from the field. I checked the hospital employment records from the main archive. He's listed as having resigned in December 1948, but there's no further information." They made their way to the records room, where Michael Tanner began carefully examining the restricted files. "The government connection is particularly interesting," he said. "During and after World War II, there were numerous classified research programs involving medicine and psychology. MK-Ultra is the most infamous, but that didn't begin until the early 1950s. Could this Project Lighthouse have been a precursor?" Mark asked. "Possibly," Tanner replied. "Or a completely separate program that was discontinued." Dr. Reed had moved to the filing cabinets containing patient records. "We need to understand who these patients were. Were they all military personnel suffering from combat trauma? Or were there civilians as well?" She began systematically reviewing files, noting details in a small notebook. After about an hour, she looked up with a troubled expression. "Something doesn't add up," she said. "I've reviewed records for 15 patients who were here in December 1948. Only 7 were military personnel with combat-related issues. The others were civilians with various diagnoses: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, even a few with no clear psychiatric diagnosis at all." "Maybe they expanded the research parameters," Sarah suggested. "Perhaps," Dr. Reed agreed. "But there's something else. The treatment notes become increasingly strange in the months leading up to December 1948. Listen to this entry for Elizabeth Winters, dated November 3rd. Patient continues to report auditory hallucinations, claims to hear voices coming from the walls. Of note, 3 other patients on the ward reported identical hallucinations at precisely the same time, despite being in separate rooms with no means of communication. Michael Tanner had found something as well. These restricted files contain references to collective manifestation phenomena beginning in mid-1948. Dr. Kaplan appears to have shifted the focus of his research from treatment to documentation of these events. "What exactly does collective manifestation phenomena mean?" Mark asked. "As far as I can tell from these notes, it refers to shared hallucinations or delusions among multiple patients," Tanner explained. Kaplan theorized that intense psychological trauma might create a kind of resonance between patients. He describes it as the bleeding of one damaged mind into another. Sarah shivered involuntarily. That sounds more like parapsychology than medicine. "The line between the two wasn't always clear back then," Dr. Reed noted, "especially in classified research. The government was exploring all possibilities, including some we'd consider fringe science today." Mark had been examining the laboratory equipment. "This machine here, I initially thought it was for electroshock therapy, but looking at it more closely, I don't think that's what it is at all." The device consisted of a central metal chair surrounded by a circular array of what appeared to be early electronic equipment. Attached to the chair were leather restraints and a helmet-like apparatus with numerous wires extending from it. "According to this technical manual," Mark continued, holding up a dust-covered booklet, "it's called a neuroresonance amplifier. It was designed to, this can't be right, strengthen and focus the patient's mental projections while simultaneously rendering them receptive to external psychic stimuli." "That's impossible," Sarah said flatly. "You can't amplify thoughts." "By modern scientific understanding, no," Dr. Reed agreed. "But in the 1940s, the boundaries of neuroscience were still being defined, and in a classified government program, researchers might have been given latitude to explore unconventional theories. Michael Tanner was now examining the film canisters. "We should view these recordings. They might provide some clarity about what they were actually doing here." After some discussion, they decided to take one of the film canisters, labeled Patient Observation 17, November 1948, to be properly digitized and viewed under controlled conditions at the university. The rest would remain untouched until a complete preservation plan could be implemented. As they were preparing to leave, Dr. Reed made an interesting discovery in one of the patient rooms. Behind a loose section of baseboard, she found a small journal belonging to a nurse named Helen Crawford. "This might give us a perspective outside the official records," she said, carefully placing the journal in a preservation bag. "Personal accounts are invaluable for historical context." 1 week later, Mark sat in a darkened room at Ohio State University with Dr. Reed, Michael Tanner, and Sarah Chen. A technician had carefully restored and digitized the film they had taken from the hidden wing. Now it was ready for viewing. "Just to prepare you," Dr. Reed said, "medical documentation from this era can be quite clinical and sometimes disturbing by modern standards. Patient consent, as we understand it today, wasn't always prioritized." The film began with a title card, Patient Observation 17. Subject, Robert Fisher, November 24, 1948. The same Robert Fisher who had been admitted just weeks before the wing was sealed. The black and white footage showed a man in his early 30s sitting in the metal chair they had found in the laboratory. He was wearing standard patient clothing, light-colored pajamas, and appeared nervous but cooperative. A voice off camera, presumably Dr. Kaplan's, could be heard giving instructions. "This will be our 17th attempt at directed manifestation," the voice explained. "Mr. Fisher has demonstrated unusual receptivity in previous sessions. Today we will attempt to focus his perceptions on Subject B, who is located in Isolation Room 3. The camera panned briefly to show medical monitoring equipment and 3 nurses standing by, before returning to Fisher. A technician placed the helmet-like device on Fisher's head and secured it. "Begin activation sequence," Kaplan ordered. The machine hummed to life, gauges on the equipment fluctuating. Fisher's initially tense expression gradually relaxed into an almost trance-like state. "Mr. Fisher," Kaplan's voice called, "can you describe what you're experiencing?" Fisher's eyes remained closed. Darkness at first, then lights, like stars, but wrong somehow. They move with purpose. His voice was dreamy, detached. "Can you sense Subject B?" Kaplan asked. Fisher nodded slowly. "Yes, he's afraid. So afraid. He sees them too, but closer. They're approaching him." "Who is approaching?" Kaplan pressed. "The others. The ones between spaces." Fisher's breathing had accelerated. "They found a way through. The machine. It's like a beacon to them." One of the nurses in the background looked alarmed, whispering something to a colleague. "Mr. Fisher, I want you to focus on my voice," Kaplan said, a new urgency in his tone. "Return your attention to this room." But Fisher continued, his voice growing more agitated. "They're with him now. Subject B is screaming, but not with his mouth, in his mind. They're coming through him somehow." Suddenly the medical equipment began to malfunction, gauges swinging wildly, lights flickering. Fisher's body tensed, his back arching. "Shut it down," a female voice called from off-camera. "Dr. Kaplan, we need to shut it down now." "Not yet," Kaplan insisted. "We're on the verge of confirmation. Fisher, what do you see now?" Fisher's eyes snapped open, but they appeared wrong somehow. The pupils dilated to an impossible degree. "They're coming through," he whispered, his voice suddenly different, deeper. "They've been waiting so long. The war weakened the barriers. All that death, all that suffering created openings." The camera began to shake as if the operator was having trouble holding it steady. For a brief moment something appeared to move across the frame, a distortion in the air like heat waves, but more defined. "My God," Kaplan's voice whispered. Then, more urgently, "Emergency protocol. Sedate him immediately." A nurse rushed forward with a syringe, but before she could reach Fisher, the film abruptly ended. The room was silent as the screen went blank. Finally, Sarah spoke. "What did we just watch?" Dr. Reed looked troubled. "Patient experimentation, certainly. Beyond that." She shook her head. "The terminology suggests they believed they were dealing with some form of telepathy or shared consciousness. But what happened to Subject B? And what was that distortion in the frame?" Mark asked. "Film degradation, most likely," Michael Tanner said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "These old 16mm films often develop artifacts over time. Dr. Reed had been reviewing her notes. "We should read Nurse Crawford's journal. It might provide some context for what we just saw." The journal had been carefully preserved and digitized as well. Dr. Reed displayed the scanned pages on her laptop, beginning from October 1948. October 12, 1948. "Dr. Kaplan's research has taken a concerning turn," she read aloud. "What began as therapy for war trauma has evolved into something I don't fully understand. The patients speak of shared dreams, of voices that call to them from the spaces between walls. 3 patients had to be sedated last night after experiencing identical nightmares at precisely 3:17 a.m. She continued to the next entry. October 28th. The new patient, Williams, began exhibiting symptoms within hours of his first treatment in the NRA device. This is unprecedented. Previous subjects required multiple sessions before showing any receptivity. Dr. Kaplan was pleased, but I find it deeply troubling. The entries continued, describing escalating incidents throughout November. Patients speaking in unison despite being in separate rooms, inexplicable cold spots in the ward, equipment malfunctions that engineers couldn't explain. Then came the entry for December 16th, the day before the final logbook entry they had found in the ward. "Something happened to Fisher today. During the session, he began speaking in a voice that wasn't his own. The things he said, I cannot bring myself to record them here. Dr. Kaplan believes we've achieved a breakthrough, but Jenkins and I are frightened. Subject B died during the session, heart failure officially, but I was there. What I saw, no natural cause could explain it. His face, God help me, his face." The final entry was dated December 17, 1948, the same day as the last logbook entry. "Kaplan has ordered the emergency protocol. Too late, I fear. Fisher escaped containment last night. We found him in the east wall utility shaft, carving symbols into the concrete with his bare hands, his fingernails torn to the quick. The things coming through the walls now are not just voices. Jenkins saw something in room 7 that caused him to claw at his own eyes. Williams and 3 others are dead. The military personnel are arriving within the hour to contain the situation. Crawford thinks they'll seal the entire wing. I'm leaving these notes in the hope that someone might understand what happened here, what we awakened. If you're reading this, stay away. They are still here, in the spaces between." The room was silent again, each person processing what they had heard. Finally, Michael Tanner spoke. "This is clearly the delusional writing of someone under extreme stress. Whatever happened in that wing, a patient riot, a failed experiment, perhaps even some kind of toxic exposure causing hallucinations, it was traumatic enough to create this elaborate fantasy. That's the rational explanation." Dr. Reed agreed, though her voice lacked conviction. The hospital administration at the time likely covered up a tragic incident to avoid scandal. Sealing off the wing and falsifying records would have been extreme but not unprecedented. Mark had been quiet, thinking about the carving he had seen on the wall. "They are coming through. God help us all. We should go back," he said suddenly. "There's more to find, more context we need." Sarah looked unsure. "After reading this, it sounds like something terrible happened there, regardless of whether you believe the supernatural implications. Exactly why we need to understand it properly," Mark insisted. "Historical accuracy is important. We can't just leave it half explored." After some discussion, they agreed to return to the hidden wing one more time, focusing specifically on gathering all written records for proper archival preservation. The university would send a larger team later for the equipment and other artifacts. The following day, Mark returned to Oakridge Memorial with Dr. Reed and Michael Tanner. Sarah had arranged for them to have full access to the hidden wing, though she herself had a budget meeting she couldn't miss. "The preservation team will be here next week," Dr. Reed explained as they walked through the now familiar corridor. "Today we're just focusing on gathering all paper records." They split up to cover more ground, Mark taking the laboratory, Dr. Reed the patient rooms, and Michael Tanner returning to the records room. They had brought proper archival materials, acid-free boxes, gloves, and preservation bags for anything they found. In the laboratory, Mark methodically worked through drawers and cabinets, finding research notes, equipment manuals, and personal notebooks belonging to Dr. Kaplan. The notes became increasingly erratic in the later entries, the handwriting deteriorating from Kaplan's initially precise script to a hurried scrawl. One notebook contained detailed descriptions of the manifestation phenomena, including hand-drawn diagrams of what Kaplan called incursion points, places where the barrier between worlds was supposedly thinnest. Mark found himself both disturbed and fascinated by the evident breakdown of a once rational scientific mind. After about 2 hours, they regrouped in the corridor, each carrying boxes of documents. "I found patient diaries," Dr. Reed said. "Many of them wrote about their experiences here. The consistency between their accounts is remarkable. Either they were influencing each other somehow, or they were all experiencing the same phenomena." "I discovered personnel files," Tanner added, "including Dr. Kaplan's background. He served as a military psychiatrist during the war and witnessed the Trinity test in 1945, the first detonation of a nuclear weapon. According to his own notes, he believed that the explosion had torn something fundamental in the fabric of reality. That seems to have been the genesis of his later theories." Mark was about to share his findings when a loud metallic clang echoed from somewhere deeper in the wing. All three froze. "What was that?" Dr. Reed whispered. "Probably just the building settling," Tanner suggested. "These old structures make all kinds of noises." Mark wasn't convinced. "I'll check it out. It sounded like it came from the far end, past the laboratory." "We should stay together," Dr. Reed insisted, a note of unease in her voice. They moved as a group toward the sound, past the laboratory to a section they hadn't fully explored before. The corridor ended at a heavy metal door marked isolation. Unlike the other doors, this one was secured with multiple locks. Subject B was in an isolation room, Mark remembered from the film. The locks were old and corroded. After some effort, they managed to open them, the door swinging inward with a groan of protesting metal. Beyond was a short hallway with 3 doors, isolation rooms 1, 2, and 3. Room 3, where Subject B had been during Fisher's final recorded session. The door to Room 3 was ajar, which seemed to explain the noise they had heard. Inside was a small windowless space with padded walls, now decayed and peeling. A single bed was bolted to the floor, its restraints hanging loose. But what immediately drew their attention was the wall opposite the door. Unlike the other walls, this one was covered in writing, hundreds of tiny, precise characters etched directly into the padding and the plaster beneath. Some resembled mathematical equations. Others looked like no alphabet any of them recognized. "My God," Dr. Reed breathed. "The level of detail." Mark approached the wall, studying the strange markings. "These don't look like they were made by fingernails or improvised tools. They're too precise, too uniform. And they cover the entire wall," Tanner noted. "This would have taken days, if not weeks, to create." Dr. Reed was taking photographs with her digital camera. According to the records, Subject B was a man named Thomas Gould. He was a mathematician who worked on the Manhattan Project before suffering a nervous breakdown in early 1948. Mark felt a chill as he remembered Fisher's words from the film. "They're with him now. Subject B is screaming, but not with his mouth. In his mind. They're coming through him somehow." As Dr. Reed continued photographing the wall, Mark noticed something odd about the room's dimensions. "This space is too small," he said, measuring the room with his steps. "Based on the exterior measurements, there should be at least 6 more feet beyond this wall." Tanner frowned. "You're right. There's another space behind there." They examined the wall covered in markings more carefully, eventually discovering that a section could be moved, revealing a narrow passage beyond. The passage was dark, and their flashlight beams seemed oddly muted as they shone into it. "I don't like this," Dr. Reed said. "We should wait for the full preservation team." But Mark was already stepping into the passage, curiosity overcoming caution. "It's just a small room," he called back. "Probably some kind of observation area." The space beyond was indeed small, but not an observation room. It contained a single metal chair, not unlike the one they had seen in the laboratory, but simpler. Around the chair, on the floor, walls, and even ceiling, were more of the strange markings, forming concentric circles that centered on the chair. In the chair sat a desiccated human form. Dr. Reed gasped as their lights illuminated the grim tableau. The figure was mummified, preserved in the sealed, dry environment. It wore what remained of hospital pajamas, and its hands were secured to the chair's armrests with leather restraints. "Is that Fisher?" Tanner asked, his academic detachment finally cracking. Mark moved closer, forcing himself to examine the corpse. The patient file said Fisher was in his 30s. "This looks right. They left him here," Dr. Reed whispered. "When they sealed the wing, they left him here." Mark was looking at something clutched in the corpse's right hand, a small object that glinted in the flashlight beam. Carefully, he reached out and extracted it from the desiccated fingers. It was a key, old and tarnished, but recognizable as a standard hospital master key from the era. Why would they leave him locked in here with a key? Tanner wondered. Mark examined the room more carefully, noticing that there was no keyhole on the inside of the hidden door. The key wasn't to get out, he realized. Look at these markings on the floor. They form a perfect circle around the chair, unbroken. Dr. Reed had been examining the writings on the wall with growing concern. Some of these symbols, they appear in multiple patients' accounts. They describe them as the language of the spaces between. A sudden draft caused the lights to flicker, and for a moment, Mark thought he heard something, a faint whisper at the very edge of audibility. The temperature in the small room seemed to drop several degrees in an instant. We need to leave, Dr. Reed said firmly. Now, bring the key, but otherwise we leave everything exactly as we found it. They backed out of the hidden room, closing the concealed door behind them. As they did, Mark could have sworn he saw something move in his peripheral vision, a distortion in the air, similar to what they had glimpsed on the film. They hurried back through the isolation corridor, the main hallway, and finally to the entrance of the hidden wing, none of them speaking until they had passed through the doorway that had been sealed for nearly 50 years. What do we tell Sarah and the hospital board? Tanner asked once they were back in the active part of the hospital, his voice unsteady despite his effort to maintain composure. Dr. Reed's face was pale, but her voice was resolute. The truth. We found human remains that appear to date from the time the wing was sealed. This is now potentially a criminal investigation. Unauthorized medical experimentation, possible involuntary confinement, and at minimum, failure to report a death. Mark nodded, but his mind was still in that hidden room with the strange symbols and the corpse that had been Fisher. He closed his hand around the key in his pocket, feeling its weight, a tangible connection to whatever had happened in December 1948. The discovery of human remains changed everything. The local police were called, followed by the state authorities, and finally the FBI, given the potential connection to a classified government program. The hidden wing was declared a crime scene, and the renovation project was halted indefinitely. Mark, Dr. Reed, and Michael Tanner were interviewed extensively about their findings. The documents they had recovered were taken as evidence, though they were assured copies would eventually be provided for historical research once the investigation was complete. 3 weeks after their discovery in the isolation room, Mark was contacted by Special Agent Diana Lawson from the FBI's Cleveland field office. She asked to meet him privately at a coffee shop in downtown Millfield. The coffee shop was nearly empty when Mark arrived. Agent Lawson was already there, a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and the kind of face that revealed nothing she didn't intend to. She wore a navy blue pantsuit that practically screamed federal agent. "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Jensen," she said as he sat down across from her. "I've been assigned to the Oakridge Memorial case. Have you found anything?" Mark asked. "The hospital administration keeps saying they have no records of what happened in 1948. "That's actually why I wanted to talk to you," Lawson replied, her voice low. "Officially, the investigation is ongoing. Unofficially, it's being shut down." Mark stared at her. "What? Why?" "Orders from above." She looked frustrated. "Yesterday, 2 men from the Department of Defense showed up and claimed jurisdiction over anything related to Project Lighthouse. They're classifying everything we found." "They can't do that," Mark protested. "This is a potential homicide investigation." "A 50-year-old homicide with national security implications," Lawson corrected. "They absolutely can do it, and they have." She hesitated, then reached into her briefcase and withdrew a manila envelope. "But before they arrived, I made copies of some of the documents. This isn't everything, but it's something." Mark took the envelope, surprised by her willingness to bend the rules. "Why are you giving me this?" Lawson's professional demeanor cracked slightly, revealing something that looked like genuine fear. "Because I've seen the reports from our forensic team. The body in that room, preliminary dating confirms it's from 1948, but the cause of death," she trailed off. "What about it?" Mark pressed. "There wasn't one," she said flatly. "No trauma, no disease, no toxins. According to our experts, that man's body simply stopped. Every system simultaneously shut down without explanation." She glanced around the coffee shop, then continued. "And there's something else. The symbols on the walls. Our analysts found identical markings at 3 other locations across the country. All government research facilities. All closed between 1948 and 1951. All still classified." Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the coffee shop's air conditioning. "What were they doing there?" "I don't know. Lawson admitted. But whatever it was, someone is still covering it up 50 years later. That's not normal, even for government secrets. She stood up. I never gave you those documents, Mr. Jensen. We never had this conversation. After she left, Mark opened the envelope. Inside were photocopies of various documents, pages from Kaplan's notebooks, official Project Lighthouse reports, and personnel files. But what caught his attention immediately was a photograph paperclipped to the top. A group photo of the Oakridge psychiatric staff from 1946. 7 people stood in front of the hospital entrance, all wearing white coats. A caption below identified each. L to R, Dr. Victor Kaplan, Dr. James Wright, Nurse Helen Crawford, Dr. Robert Stein, Nurse Mary Jenkins, Dr. William Crawford, Dr. Thomas Gould. Mark froze, staring at the last name. Thomas Gould, the mathematician from the Manhattan Project. Subject B, who had supposedly died during Fisher's final session. But according to this photo, Gould wasn't a patient at all. He was one of the doctors. Mark spent the next several days poring over the documents Agent Lawson had given him, trying to make sense of the conflicting information. He called Dr. Reed and shared his discovery about Gould, and she agreed to meet him at her university office to discuss the implications. If Gould was originally part of the medical team, how did he become Subject B? Dr. Reed wondered as they spread the documents across her desk. And why would the records deliberately misidentify him? I think I found something that might explain it, Mark said, pointing to an entry from Kaplan's personal notebook, dated March 1948. Listen to this. Gould's behavior has become increasingly erratic. Since beginning self-experimentation with the NRA device, he claims to hear voices emanating from what he calls the thin places. Most disturbing is his insistence that these voices are familiar to him from his work at Los Alamos, that they were somehow present during the Trinity test. Dr. Reed frowned. So Gould used the device on himself and began experiencing symptoms similar to what they later observed in patients? Exactly, Mark confirmed. And there's more. In June 1948, Kaplan writes, Gould has been confined for his own safety. His episodes are becoming more frequent and severe. During yesterday's incident, 3 orderlies were required to subdue him after he attempted to carve symbols into the wall of his office using a scalpel. The symbols match those reported by patients Jenkins and Williams during their NRA sessions. So they reclassified him from doctor to patient, Dr. Reed mused, and eventually to research subject. Mark nodded. By September, he's referred to only as Subject B in the official records. His identity was essentially erased. They continued through the documents, piecing together a disturbing narrative. Project Lighthouse had begun as a legitimate, if ethically questionable, research program studying combat trauma and potential treatments. But somewhere along the way, the focus had shifted to investigating the strange phenomena patients began experiencing during the experimental treatments. The NRA device was originally designed to help patients process traumatic memories, Dr. Reed said, reviewing the technical specifications. But Kaplan modified it extensively over time, apparently trying to amplify what he called cross-dimensional perception. He believed the trauma of war had somehow sensitized certain individuals to something else, Mark added, something existing outside normal perception. A report from November 1948 described increasing manifestation events throughout the ward, unexplained cold spots, electrical malfunctions, and most disturbing physical objects found rearranged or altered when no one had been present. The government was clearly concerned, Dr. Reed noted, pointing to a letter from a Department of Defense liaison. They threatened to pull funding unless Kaplan could provide tangible results demonstrating military application, which might explain why he accelerated the experiments in December, Mark suggested. He was desperate to prove his theories before the project was shut down. The final document in the collection was a partial transcript of a recording made on December 16, 1948, the day before the emergency protocol was enacted. It appeared to be Kaplan's last official report, dictated into a recording device. Project Lighthouse Final Summary. Our work has confirmed what Gould first theorized, that consciousness extends beyond our conventional understanding of reality. The spaces between worlds are populated, and under certain conditions, these entities can perceive us as we now perceive them. The NRA device functions as a doorway. Subject B provided the initial connection, but Fisher has proven to be the ideal conduit. His unprecedented neurological sensitivity allows for sustained contact, The entities have communicated their intention to transition into our plane of existence. They require anchor points, human minds sufficiently modified to serve as gateways. I believed we were in control of this process. I was mistaken. The transition has already begun, independent of our equipment. Fisher's escape last night and the subsequent incidents confirm that physical containment is no longer effective. Crawford and Jenkins are exhibiting signs of conversion. Williams died during a spontaneous manifestation event at 0300 hours. Military leadership has been informed of the situation. Their response is en route. I've ordered emergency lockdown procedures, but must acknowledge the possibility that conventional measures will prove insufficient. If the transcript ended abruptly there, Mark and Dr. Reed sat in silence for several minutes, processing the implications of what they had read. This is, Dr. Reed began, then stopped, struggling to find words. Even interpreting this through a rational lens, it describes a catastrophic breakdown in a research environment. Mass hysteria, possibly induced by experimental drugs or psychological manipulation techniques. But what about the body we found? Mark asked. Fisher, left in that hidden room behind walls covered in those symbols? Dr. Reed sighed. Without access to the forensic reports, we can only speculate. But psychology has documented cases of people literally dying from extreme fear or suggestion. The nocebo effect can be powerful. Mark wasn't satisfied with this explanation, but before he could respond, his cell phone rang. The small Nokia screen displayed unknown number. He answered cautiously. Mr. Jensen? The voice was male, unfamiliar. This is Dr. Alan Parker from the Department of Defense. I understand you've been looking into the Oakridge Memorial situation. Mark's eyes widened as he looked at Dr. Reed. How did you get this number? That's not important, Parker replied. What is important is that you understand the sensitivity of this matter. The documentation you've been reviewing is classified. I don't have any classified, Mark began. Please don't insult my intelligence, Parker interrupted. Agent Lawson has been disciplined for her indiscretion. Now I'm calling to give you one opportunity to turn over all materials in your possession related to Project Lighthouse. After that, things become more complicated. Mark felt a surge of anger. Are you threatening me? This was potentially a crime scene. People died. A very long time ago, Mr. Jensen, Parker said coolly, and under circumstances that have national security implications even today. I'll be at your office tomorrow at noon. Have everything ready. He hung up without waiting for a response. Mark looked at Dr. Reed, who had heard enough of the conversation to understand its gravity. What do we do now? He asked. She considered for a moment. Make copies of everything, first of all. Then we need to decide how far we're willing to take this. What do you mean? These people buried this story 50 years ago, she explained. They clearly intend to bury it again. The question is whether we let them. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. The documents from Agent Lawson were hidden in a friend's storage unit, with copies safely distributed to both Dr. Reed and Michael Tanner. But it wasn't fear of government agents that kept him awake. It was the image of Fisher's body in that hidden room, surrounded by symbols that seemed to radiate meaning just beyond his comprehension. Around 3 a.m., he gave up on sleep and drove back to Oakridge Memorial. The renovation site would be deserted at this hour, and he knew the security codes from his work as the project engineer. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for. Just a compulsion to see the hidden wing one more time before everything was locked away behind government classification. The hospital was eerily quiet as he made his way through the partially demolished sections to the east wing. Yellow police tape still cordoned off the entrance to the hidden corridor, but it was easy enough to duck under. He switched on his flashlight and stepped back into the past. Everything looked the same. The nurse's station frozen in time. The patient rooms untouched except for the evidence markers placed by FBI technicians. But something felt different. The air seemed heavier somehow, charged with an energy he couldn't identify. Mark made his way to the isolation rooms, drawn inexorably to the place where they had found Fisher's body. The police had removed the remains, but the room with its wall of strange markings remained. He entered cautiously, playing his flashlight beam across the symbols that covered the wall. Now, alone in the dark, he noticed something they had missed before. When viewed from certain angles, the symbols seemed to shift slightly, as if drawn in more dimensions than the wall possessed. It was a subtle effect, possibly just a trick of the light and his tired mind, but unsettling nonetheless. The hidden door to the small room where Fisher had been found was still there, now marked with police tape. Mark hesitated, then pushed it open and stepped inside. The chair was empty, but the circular patterns of symbols remained on the floor, walls, and ceiling. Mark found himself standing in the center, where the chair had been, his flashlight illuminating the concentric rings of strange markings, and then he noticed something odd: his shadow. It didn't match his position. As he moved the flashlight, the shadow seemed to lag slightly, moving a fraction of a second after he did. He waved his hand experimentally, watching as the shadow followed just out of sync. A sudden chill ran through him. The air temperature seemed to drop precipitously, his breath fogging in front of him. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the beam dimmed almost to nothing before returning to full strength. In that brief moment of near darkness, he saw them, subtle distortions in the air, like heat waves, but with definite form and purpose. They moved around the perimeter of the symbol circle, never crossing the boundary, but traveling along it like animals pacing a cage. Mark stood frozen, heart pounding as his flashlight stabilized and the distortions vanished from view. But he could still feel a presence, multiple presences, just beyond his perception. "Fisher?" he whispered, not knowing why that name came to his lips. No response came, but the air seemed to thicken further, pressing against him from all sides. His ears popped as if the pressure had changed suddenly. The key. The thought came to him unbidden. Fisher had been holding a key when they found him. Mark reached into his pocket and withdrew the hospital master key he had taken from Fisher's desiccated hand. He had meant to turn it in as evidence, but had forgotten in the chaos following their discovery. Now it felt unusually heavy in his palm and strangely warm despite the chill in the room. As he held it up, the symbols on the walls seemed to shift again, reorienting themselves toward the key as if drawn by magnetism. A high-pitched ringing began in his ears, growing steadily louder. Panicking, Mark backed out of the circle, nearly falling in his haste. As soon as he crossed the boundary of symbols, the pressure eased and the ringing subsided. He looked down at the key in his hand and was shocked to see that the metal was now inscribed with tiny markings, the same symbols that covered the walls, etched into the metal as if by acid. A noise from the corridor outside the isolation rooms jolted him from his horrified fascination. Flashlight beams played across the walls. Someone else was in the hidden wing. Mark quickly pocketed the key and slipped out of the hidden room, closing the concealed door behind him. He could hear voices now, at least 2 people approaching the isolation area. "Final sweep before the containment team arrives," a male voice was saying. "The symbols are the priority. Document everything, then initiate sterilization protocol." "What about civilian witnesses?" a second voice asked. "Being handled," the first voice replied. "Standard procedure." Discreditation followed by monitoring. Mark looked around desperately for a place to hide. The only option was a small supply closet across from Isolation Room 3. He slipped inside just as the flashlight beams reached the isolation corridor. Through a small ventilation grate in the door, he could see 2 men in dark suits methodically photographing the symbols on the walls of Room 3. They wore latex gloves and moved with the efficiency of professionals who had done this many times before. "Identical to the Denver site," one commented. "Fisher was more methodical than Gould." "The anchor point is stable," the other replied, running some kind of handheld device over the wall of symbols. The device emitted a soft beeping sound. "Minimal leakage. Level 2 containment should be sufficient." "And the remains?" "Already secured. Full analysis underway at Site 27. They continued their work, unaware of Mark's presence. After about 20 minutes, they packed their equipment and left, their voices fading down the corridor. Mark waited several more minutes before emerging from his hiding place, his mind racing. Containment team, sterilization protocol, anchor point. The clinical terminology somehow made the situation more terrifying than any supernatural explanation. He hurried back through the hidden wing, desperate to leave before the men returned or others arrived. As he passed the nurse's station, his flashlight beam caught something that hadn't been there before. A manila folder placed precisely in the center of the desk. Against his better judgment, Mark paused to examine it. The folder was labeled Fisher R. Final Status, and appeared to be recently printed, not a 50-year-old document. Inside was a single page with a short typewritten report. Subject maintains awareness despite physical termination. Connection sustained through symbolic architecture. Transition parameters unchanged since 1948 evaluation. Recommend continued isolation and standard containment procedures. Civilian discovery presents minimal risk due to ontological resistance. See Addendum C for witness management. Paperclip to the report was a list of names. Mark's was at the top, followed by Dr. Reed, Michael Tanner, Sarah Chen, and the others who had been involved in the discovery of the hidden wing. With growing horror, Mark realized the document had been left deliberately for him to find. The men had known he was there all along. This was a message, or a warning. He fled the hidden wing, no longer caring about stealth or security systems. The hospital corridors seemed to stretch endlessly before him, and more than once he thought he saw movement at the corner of his vision, those same distortions he had observed in the symbol room. Finally reaching his car, he drove home in a state of near panic, constantly checking his rearview mirror for headlights. The key in his pocket felt like it was burning against his leg, and twice he nearly pulled over to throw it away. But something stopped him, a certainty that the key was important, perhaps vital, to understanding what was happening. When he reached his apartment, he called Dr. Reed despite the early hour. Her sleepy voice answered on the fourth ring. "They know everything," he said without preamble. "They're coming for all of us who were involved." "Mark?" She sounded confused, then concerned. "What are you talking about? Where are you?" "I went back to the hospital," he admitted. "There were men there, government types. They left a document with our names on it. They're planning something they call witness management." "Slow down," Dr. Reed said, fully awake now. "Start from the beginning." He told her everything. The strange behavior of his shadow, the distortions he had seen, the men with their equipment, and the document they had left for him to find. As he spoke, he could hear how it sounded, the ramblings of someone unstable, possibly hallucinating from stress and lack of sleep. "Mark," Dr. Reed said gently when he finished, "I think you need to rest. You've been under enormous pressure these past weeks. The mind can play tricks. I'm not imagining this," he insisted. "The key, Fisher's key, it changed. The symbols appeared on it right in front of me." There was a long pause before Dr. Reed spoke again. "Where are you now?" "At my apartment." "Stay there. Don't go anywhere. Don't talk to anyone. I'll come over first thing in the morning and we can figure this out together." After hanging up, Mark sat at his kitchen table, the key placed in front of him. The tiny symbols etched into its surface seemed to shift subtly in the dim light, reorganizing themselves into patterns that almost made sense before dissolving again into incomprehensibility. He must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing he knew, there was a knock at his door and sunlight was streaming through the windows. He checked his watch, 7:30 a.m. Dr. Reed had arrived earlier than he expected. Still groggy, he went to the door and opened it without checking the peephole. It wasn't Dr. Reed standing in the hallway, but Dr. Alan Parker from the Department of Defense, the man who had called him the previous day. He wasn't alone. Two other men in suits flanked him, their expressions neutral but watchful. "Mr. Jensen," Parker said with a thin smile, "I believe we had an appointment for noon, but it seems you've accelerated our timeline with your nocturnal activities." Mark tried to close the door, but one of the men smoothly inserted his foot in the gap, preventing it from shutting. "I have nothing to say to you," Mark declared, trying to keep the fear from his voice. "On the contrary," Parker replied, "you have a great deal to tell us, particularly about what you experienced in Isolation Room 3 last night. May we come in? This conversation would be better conducted in private." Realizing he had little choice, Mark stepped back, allowing the three men to enter his apartment. Parker immediately spotted the key on the kitchen table and nodded to one of his companions, who moved to retrieve it. "Don't touch that," Mark warned, surprising himself with his vehemence. The man paused, looking to Parker for guidance. Parker studied Mark with new interest. "You've begun to understand, haven't you? Faster than we anticipated. The symbols have already established a connection." "What are you talking about?" Mark demanded. "What is Project Lighthouse really about?" Parker gestured for everyone to sit. After a moment's hesitation, Mark complied, keeping his distance from the other men. "Project Lighthouse," Parker began, "was never about treating combat trauma. That was merely the cover story. It began because Dr. Victor Kaplan and Dr. Thomas Gould, both present at the Trinity test in 1945, experienced something during the detonation that defied conventional explanation. The spaces between worlds," Mark murmured, recalling Kaplan's notes. Parker nodded. "A crude but essentially accurate description. The immense energy of the nuclear explosion temporarily thinned the barriers between our reality and another. Kaplan and Gould glimpsed something on the other side, something that noticed them in return. You can't seriously expect me to believe what you believe is irrelevant, Mr. Jensen," Parker interrupted. "The project confirmed the existence of non-conventional entities capable of interacting with our reality under specific conditions. The NRA device was designed to create controlled access points, windows, if you will, to study these entities. But something went wrong, Mark said. Gould became obsessed, Parker acknowledged. He modified the equipment without authorization, attempting to create a permanent passage rather than a temporary window. By the time Kaplan realized what was happening, it was too late. Gould had succeeded, at least partially. The entities began manifesting physically, first in Gould himself, then in other patients. And Fisher? Robert Fisher was unique, a mind perfectly attuned to cross-dimensional frequencies. He became both conduit and anchor point. When containment failed in December 1948, the military had no choice but to seal the entire wing, with Fisher still inside. Mark thought of the body they had found, positioned in the center of the symbol circle. You left him there deliberately. As a focal point, Parker confirmed, his clinical tone making the horror of it even more profound. The symbols he carved contained the breach, channeling it through his consciousness, even after physical death. A living firewall, if you will. That's monstrous, Mark whispered. It was necessary, Parker countered. The alternative was potentially catastrophic, and it worked. For 50 years, the breach remained contained, the entities unable to fully cross over. He leaned forward, until you and your colleagues unsealed the wing and disturbed the anchor point. The implication hung in the air between them. Mark glanced at the key on the table, now understanding its significance. Fisher wasn't trying to escape. The key wasn't for getting out. Very good, Mr. Jensen, Parker said with what sounded like genuine approval. The key was the final component of the containment system, a physical focus for the symbolic architecture. When you removed it from Fisher's possession, you compromised the integrity of the entire structure. So what happens now? Mark asked, already suspecting the answer. Now we implement established protocols for containment breaches, Parker replied. The hospital wing will be permanently secured. All evidence will be classified, and those exposed to the breach. He paused, studying Mark carefully. Well, that depends on the level of contamination. Contamination? Symbolic transference, one of the other men explained. The entities communicate through patterns, visual, auditory, even conceptual. Exposure to these patterns alters neural pathways, creating receptivity. Like infection vectors in a viral outbreak, Parker added. Some people are more susceptible than others. You, Mr. Jensen, appear to be highly receptive, like Fisher was. Mark suddenly understood the true reason for their visit. You're not here to threaten me or silence me. You're here to recruit me. Parker smiled thinly. The program continues, Mr. Jensen. Project Lighthouse was merely the beginning. We've learned a great deal in 50 years about managing these breaches and utilizing the unique properties of individuals who can perceive beyond conventional reality. And if I refuse, then we implement standard containment procedures for compromised civilians, Parker said simply. Memory modification, psychological discreditation, lifetime monitoring. Effective, but wasteful of your potential. The key on the table seemed to pulse in Mark's peripheral vision, the symbols on its surface rearranging themselves like living things. He could feel something stirring in his mind, awareness of spaces he had never perceived before, dimensions folded within dimensions. The others who were exposed, Mark said, thinking of Dr. Reed and Michael Tanner. What about them? Already being evaluated, Parker assured him. Dr. Reed shows minimal receptivity. She'll likely be cleared with standard memory protocols. Mr. Tanner is somewhat more sensitive. We'll know more after today's assessment. And what exactly would I be doing if I joined your program? The same thing we've been doing since 1948, Parker replied. Studying the entities, containing breaches, and preparing for the possibility of wider contact. He paused. There are more thinned places now than ever before. Consequences of nuclear testing, high-energy physics experiments, perhaps even collective psychological factors we don't fully understand. We need people who can perceive these breaches before they widen. Mark looked at the three men, understanding now that they weren't simply government agents. They were gatekeepers standing at the boundary between worlds, monitoring incursions from something beyond human comprehension. Do I have time to think about it? He asked. Parker checked his watch. The containment team arrives at Oakridge Memorial at noon to begin sterilization procedures. Your decision would be most useful before then. The key on the table had stopped moving, the symbols now arranged in a fixed pattern that tugged at Mark's mind with almost physical force. He could feel connections forming, neural pathways restructuring themselves to accommodate perceptions beyond normal human experience. And somewhere, in spaces he was just beginning to perceive, something was waiting. had been waiting since it first noticed humans in the blinding flash of the Trinity test, waiting for the barriers to thin enough for passage. "I'll help you contain the breach," Mark said finally, "but I want guarantees that Dr. Reed and the others will be safe." Parker nodded. "Acceptable terms. We'll provide full details en route to the facility." He stood, gesturing to the key. "Bring it with you. It's part of you now, a focus for your emerging abilities." As Mark picked up the key, he felt a momentary connection to Robert Fisher, the man who had sat in that hidden room for 50 years, his consciousness sustaining a barrier between worlds even after his body had died. Had Fisher made a similar choice, or had he been given no option at all? The question lingered in Mark's mind as he left his apartment with Parker and his associates, stepping into a new reality where the spaces between worlds were monitored by people like him. People who could perceive the thin places and the entities that waited beyond them. Behind them, Mark's apartment door swung shut, looking perfectly normal on the outside. But on the inside, in the dim light of the empty room, tiny symbols had begun to appear on the walls, spreading outward from where the key had rested, inscribing themselves into reality one by one. In the hidden wing of Oakridge Memorial, sealed once more behind layers of concrete and steel, the distortions in the air around Isolation Room 3 pulsed with patient, inhuman intelligence. They had waited 50 years. They could wait longer. The anchor point had been disturbed, the key removed. Eventually, another door would open. It was only a matter of time.